The words hit me like ice water on a summer morning. Stella, we've decided to restructure the department, and unfortunately there just isn't space for your position anymore. Marcus Chen, my boss of 12 years, couldn't even look me in the eye as he delivered the sentence that would change everything. He shuffled papers on his mahogany desk, the same desk where I'd helped him prepare presentations that earned him 3 promotions, the same desk where I'd stayed late countless nights, fixing his mistakes and polishing his ideas until they gleamed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat there in that sterile conference room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, watching him fidget with his Mont Blanc pen. The pen I'd helped him pick out when he got his first big bonus. Back then, he'd called me his secret weapon, his right hand, the person who made everything possible. Now I was apparently just taking up space. I know this comes as a shock, he continued, still avoiding eye contact, but the company is moving in a new direction. We need fresh perspectives, younger energy. There it was. At 53, I had become obsolete overnight, despite being the backbone of Rodriguez Marketing Solutions for over a decade. Despite the fact that every major client we'd landed had been through my connections, my strategies, my late-night problem-solving session, the irony wasn't lost on me that this was happening in the company that bore my own last name, not because I owned it, but because when I'd started there fresh out of my divorce, young and desperate to prove myself, Marcus had joked that having a Rodriguez at Rodriguez Marketing was destined. Back then, I'd laughed along, grateful for any job that would help me rebuild my life after my ex-husband had left me with nothing but debt and a shattered sense of self-worth. When I first walked through the glass doors of Rodriguez Marketing Solutions 12 years ago, I was a different woman entirely. My hair was shorter then, a practical bob that said I meant business, though my confidence was still recovering from the earthquake that had been my marriage to David. The divorce had been finalized just 3 months earlier, and I was carrying the weight of starting over at 41 with nothing but a marketing degree I'd earned 20 years prior and a determination that burned brighter than my fear. The office was smaller back then, occupying just 2 floors of a modest downtown building instead of the gleaming skyscraper it would eventually become. Marcus was different too, younger and hungrier, running a scrappy operation with 6 employees and dreams bigger than his budget. He'd hired me as his marketing coordinator, a title that sounded more impressive than the salary suggested, but I didn't care. I needed the work, and more importantly, I needed to prove to myself that I could still build something meaningful. Those early days were magical in the way that new beginnings can be when you're ready to pour everything you have into them. I arrived at 7 every morning, an hour before anyone else, and stayed until the janitors started their round. I reorganized their filing system, streamlined their client intake process, and slowly began transforming their haphazard marketing approach into something that actually worked. Marcus noted. He started asking for my input on everything, from campaign strategies to client meetings to the coffee they served in the lobby. Within 6 months, I'd helped land their biggest client to date, a local restaurant chain looking to expand statewide. I'd crafted a campaign that played on nostalgia and local pride, something that spoke to people's hearts instead of just their wallets. The client was so impressed they recommended us to 3 other businesses, and suddenly we weren't just surviving, we were thriving. Marcus promoted me to senior marketing strategist after my first year, and I threw myself into the role like it was my calling. I developed relationships with vendors, media contacts, and industry leaders. I knew which radio host preferred his coffee black and which newspaper editor had a weakness for homemade cookies. I remembered birthdays, anniversaries, and the names of people's children. I made myself indispensable not through manipulation, but through genuine care and relentless competence. The office began to feel like home in a way my actual apartment never quite did. I decorated my workspace with plants that I nursed back to health when others abandoned them, and I kept a candy dish filled with butterscotch that became legendary among our clients. People would stop by just to chat, to ask advice, to share their problems. I became the unofficial therapist, mediator, and problem solver for anyone who walked through our doors. By my 3rd year, the company had doubled in size, and Marcus had started talking about expansion. By my 5th year, we'd moved to the current building, and I had my own office with a view of the city skyline. By year 7, I was essentially running the day-to-day operations, while Marcus focused on bigger picture strategy and schmoozing with potential investors. I didn't mind. I loved the work, loved the challenge of turning chaos into order, loved watching ideas bloom into successful campaigns that made real differences in people's lives. My personal life remained quiet by choice. I'd dated a few times over the years, but nothing serious. The work fulfilled me in a way that relationships never had. Probably because it was something I could control. I could make myself excellent at this job. I could earn respect through merit. I could build something lasting. I bought a small house in the suburbs, a 1950s bungalow with original hardwood floors and a kitchen that needed updating. I spent weekends refinishing furniture and planting gardens, creating a sanctuary that reflected the stability I'd found in my professional life. My sister Carmen would visit sometimes, shaking her head at my dedication to the job. "You need more balance, Stella," she'd say, sipping wine on my back patio while I responded to emails on my phone. "This company isn't your whole life," but she was wrong. The company had become my life, and I was proud of that. I'd helped build something from almost nothing. I'd earned my place through sweat and skill, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. When new employees started, Marcus would introduce me as the heart of this operation, and I'd feel a warm glow of satisfaction that never got old. I trained junior staff members with patience and encouragement, remembering how terrifying it had been to start over in my 40s. I helped struggling employees find their strengths and supported them through difficult projects. When the company started winning industry awards, I was the one who coordinated the submissions and wrote the entries that highlighted our best work. When we landed national clients, I was the one who managed the relationships and ensured their expectations were not just met, but exceeded. The years blended together in the best possible way, marked by growth and achievement and the deep satisfaction of work well done. I watched Marcus mature from a scrappy entrepreneur into a polished executive. I saw junior employees become department heads, and I took pride in knowing I'd played a role in their development. I witnessed the company evolve from a small family operation into a respected player in the regional market. My office became a repository of memories and milestones. Photos from company retreats lined my bookshelf, showing teams of smiling faces at lake houses and conference center. Thank you cards from clients covered one wall, each one representing a successful project and a relationship carefully cultivated. Awards and certificates filled another wall, recognition for campaigns that had exceeded expectations and delivered real results for the businesses we serve. I developed my own rituals and traditions that became part of the company culture. I organized the annual holiday party, always held at a different venue to keep things fresh. I coordinated team-building activities and professional development workshops. I maintained the birthday calendar and made sure everyone felt celebrated. When employees were going through personal difficulties, I was the one who arranged meal trains and offered flexible schedules. The work never felt like just a job, because I'd made it into something more. I'd created a professional family, a place where people could grow and contribute and feel valued. I'd built systems and processes that made everyone's work easier and more effective. I'd established relationships with clients that went beyond transactional interactions to become genuine partnerships based on trust and mutual respect. Looking back now, I can see that I was perhaps too invested, too willing to make the company's success my primary source of identity and self-worth. But at the time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I'd found my calling, my place, my purpose. I'd survived the wreckage of my marriage and rebuilt myself into someone stronger and more capable than I'd ever imagined possible. When I thought about the future, I pictured myself growing old with this company, eventually transitioning into a senior advisory role, sharing my institutional knowledge with the next generation of marketers. I imagined retirement parties where people would tell stories about the campaigns we'd crafted together and the obstacles we'd overcome as a team. I saw myself as a permanent fixture, as essential to the company's identity as the logo on the building. I never imagined that the very success I'd helped create would eventually be used as justification for my removal. I never considered that the relationships I'd nurtured and the processes I'd built would continue just fine without me. I never thought that fresh perspectives and younger energy would become code words for making me disappear. But that morning in Marcus's office, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As he delivered his carefully rehearsed speech about restructuring and new directions, I realized that I'd built my entire sense of self on a foundation that could be demolished with a single conversation. The company that bore my name, the place where I'd invested my heart and soul, the professional home I'd spent 12 years creating, had decided there was no longer space for me. The woman who had survived divorce and rebuilt her life through sheer determination was about to discover just how much fight she still had left in her. But first, she had to fall. The signs had been there for months, subtle as shadows creeping across a sundial, but I'd been too busy, too trusting, too invested to see them clearly. Looking back now, I can trace the beginning of the end to a humid Tuesday in July when Marcus returned from a weekend conference in Austin with a new vocabulary and a distant look in his eye. He'd attended something called the Future Leaders Summit, a gathering of young entrepreneurs and industry disruptors who spoke in buzzwords about pivoting and scaling and disrupting traditional paradigms. When he walked into the Monday morning staff meeting, he was different. The easy camaraderie we'd shared for over a decade felt strained, like he was seeing me through a lens I couldn't quite bring into focus. "We need to think about our brand identity," he announced to the assembled team, his voice carrying a new authority that felt rehearsed. "The market is evolving rapidly, and we need to ensure we're positioning ourselves for the demographic shifts that are coming." He used the phrase demographic shifts 3 times in that meeting, and each time his eyes seemed to skip over me entirely. I should have paid attention to the way he kept mentioning the average age of our target consumers, how he emphasized the need for team members who could authentically connect with emerging market segments. Instead, I focused on taking detailed notes and thinking about how we could implement his suggestions into our existing client strategies. I was already mentally drafting the research proposals and budget allocations that would support his new vision. After the meeting, I approached him with enthusiasm, my notebook filled with ideas about how we could integrate his insights into our current campaign. "Marcus, I think there are some really interesting opportunities here," I began, settling into the chair across from his desk like I had hundreds of times before. "I've been thinking about how we could modernize our approach while still maintaining the relationship-building foundation that's made us successful." He nodded politely, but his attention seemed elsewhere, his fingers drumming against his desk in a rhythm that spoke of impatience rather than consideration. "Actually, Stella, I've been meaning to talk to you about delegation. You've been carrying so much of the operational load, and I think it might be time to distribute some of those responsibilities to other team members." The words should have sounded like relief, like recognition that I'd been working too hard and deserved support. Instead, they landed with a hollow thud in my chest. "I don't mind the workload," I replied carefully. "I enjoy being involved in all aspects of our operations. It helps me maintain consistency across our client relationship." "I know you do," he said, and for a moment his expression softened into something that resembled the old Marcus, the one who used to seek my input on everything from campaign strategies to office furniture. "But we need to think about scalability. We need systems that can function independently of any single person." Any single person? The phrase echoed in my mind as I returned to my office, trying to shake off the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. I told myself he was right about delegation, that I had perhaps become too controlling, too invested in maintaining personal oversight of every project. I made a conscious effort to step back, to allow other team members more autonomy, to resist my instinct to double-check every detail. But stepping back felt like watching my carefully tended garden from behind glass. I could see things happening, but I couldn't feel the soil or smell the growth or sense when something needed attention. Projects that I would have handled with nuanced understanding were now managed by junior staff, who followed protocols without understanding the relationships and history that informed every client interaction. The first real crack appeared during our quarterly client review in August. I'd prepared comprehensive reports for each account, detailed analyses that showed not just metrics and outcomes, but the story behind every campaign, the challenges we'd overcome, the innovations we'd implement. I'd spent weeks crafting presentations that would demonstrate our value and set the stage for expanded partnerships. Marcus barely glanced at my work. Instead, he handed the lead presentation role to Jessica Kim, a talented but relatively new account manager who'd been with the company for just 18 months. Jessica brings a fresh perspective to these relationships, he explained when I asked about the change. I think our clients will benefit from her innovative approach. I sat in that conference room watching Jessica present strategies that were essentially refined versions of work I'd developed over years of relationship building, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. She did well, I had to admit. She was polished and confident, speaking the language of digital transformation and customer journey optimization that seemed to resonate with the clients in a way my more traditional relationship-focused approach had not. But what stung wasn't her competence, it was the way Marcus beamed at her throughout the presentation, the way he nodded approvingly at insights that were really just repackaged versions of approaches I'd been advocating for months. When Miss Patterson from Pacific Northwest Brewing complimented our evolving vision, Marcus gave Jessica full credit without mentioning the foundational work that had made her presentation possible. After the meeting, I approached Marcus privately, choosing my words carefully to avoid sounding territorial or threatened. Jessica did a great job today, I began, meaning it sincerely. I'm wondering if there might be opportunities for me to mentor her further, to share some of the historical context that could enhance her client relationships. Marcus paused in organizing his papers, and I caught something in his expression that made my breath catch. It was pity, soft and uncomfortable, the look you give someone who doesn't realize they're no longer needed. Stella, you've been incredible over the years, your institutional knowledge is invaluable, but I think Jessica and the other junior staff need space to develop their own approaches, without being constrained by how things have always been done. How things have always been done. As if my 12 years of building relationships and delivering results were simply outdated habits that needed to be overcome. As if the foundation I'd helped create was now a limitation, rather than a strength. I nodded and smiled, maintaining the professional demeanor I'd perfected over decades of navigating difficult conversations. But walking back to my office, I felt like I was moving through water, every step requiring more effort than it should. I closed my door and sat at my desk staring at the wall of thank you cards and photos that documented years of successful partnerships and meaningful work. The changes accelerated after that. Marcus began scheduling important meetings during times when I had standing appointments with long-term clients, then expressing regret that I couldn't attend these strategic planning sessions. He started bringing in external consultants to evaluate our processes, young professionals with impressive credentials and theories about optimization, who spent weeks analyzing systems I'd developed through years of trial and refinement. One of these consultants, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Amanda Foster, who looked like she'd stepped out of a business magazine, presented her findings to the leadership team in September. I wasn't invited to the presentation, but Jessica was, along with several other junior staff members who'd been with the company for less than 3 years. I learned about the recommendations secondhand, through casual conversations and overheard phone calls. Dr. Foster had apparently identified several areas where our operations could be modernized and streamlined. She'd recommended consolidating account management responsibilities, implementing new digital tracking systems, and restructuring team dynamics to better align with contemporary workforce expectations. Another phrase that seemed designed to exclude me without saying so directly. I was 53, not 73, but in the glossy world of marketing and advertising, that apparently qualified me as a relic from a bygone era. The technology changes came next, swift and comprehensive. Our familiar project management system was replaced with a sleek new platform that required extensive training and seemed designed for people who'd grown up with smartphones. The client database I'd spent years building and refining was migrated to a cloud-based system that organized information differently, making it harder to access the relationship notes and historical context that had always been my greatest strength. I threw myself into learning the new systems with the same determination I'd brought to every challenge in my career. I stayed late, watching tutorial videos and practicing until my fingers could navigate the interfaces with something approaching competence. But it felt like learning to write with my non-dominant hand, technically possible but never quite natural. During team meetings, conversations increasingly revolved around concepts and strategies I had to research afterward to fully understand. Growth hacking, omnichannel optimization, programmatic advertising. The language of marketing was evolving faster than I could adapt, and I found myself asking questions that were met with patient explanations that made me feel like a student rather than a senior professional. Marcus began holding separate meetings with what he called the innovation team, a group of younger staff members who were tasked with developing new service offerings and exploring emerging market opportunities. These meetings happened in the conference room adjacent to my office, and I could hear the energy and excitement through the thin walls, the sound of collaboration and creativity that had once included me. I tried to insert myself into these conversations naturally, offering insights based on my experience, and suggesting ways to integrate new approaches with proven strategies. But my contributions seemed to fall flat, met with polite nods that felt more like dismissal. "That's an interesting perspective, Stella," became Marcus's standard response to my input, delivered in a tone that suggested my perspective was more historical curiosity than actionable insight. The client relationships that had been my greatest strength began to shift as well. Account management responsibilities were redistributed under the guise of load balancing and professional development opportunities. Clients I'd worked with for years were gradually transitioned to younger team members who brought fresh energy to the partnership. I watched Sarah Chen, a brilliant recent graduate with an MBA from Northwestern, take over the Meridian Hotels account that I'd managed for 8 years. She approached the relationship with impressive analytical rigor, implementing tracking systems and optimization protocols that delivered measurable improvements in campaign performance. The client was thrilled with the results, and I had to acknowledge that her data-driven approach was producing better outcomes than my more intuitive, relationship-based methods. But it hurt to see Mr. Rodriguez, the hotel chain's marketing director, who'd become almost a friend over our years of collaboration, light up when he talked about Sarah's innovative strategies. He still greeted me warmly when we encountered each other in the hallway, but our conversations had shifted from strategic planning to pleasant small talk about the weather and weekend plans. The holiday party that year felt different too. I'd organized the event as always, coordinating with vendors and managing logistics with the efficiency that had become my trademark, but the actual party felt like watching a celebration I wasn't quite part of. Marcus gave a speech about the company's bright future and innovative team, praising several junior staff members by name for their contributions to our success. He mentioned my years of dedication in passing, a single sentence that felt more like acknowledgement of past service than recognition of ongoing value. I stood near the dessert table, nursing a glass of wine and watching my colleagues laugh and network and make plans for collaboration that didn't include me. Jessica approached at one point, her face flushed with wine and success, and thanked me for all the guidance I'd provided. "You've taught me so much," she said warmly. "I hope I can carry on the standard you've set." Carry on, as if I were already gone, as if my role was to pass the torch rather than continue holding it myself. I smiled and thanked her, maintaining the grace and professionalism that had always been my calling card, but something inside me felt like it was slowly cracking. The breaking point came in November during our annual strategy retreat. For 12 years, I'd been Marcus's partner in planning these sessions, helping design agendas and facilitate discussions that shaped our direction for the coming year. This time, I learned about the retreat through a calendar invitation sent to all staff, a formal notice for an event I'd helped create. The retreat was held at a mountain resort outside the city, a beautiful setting that should have inspired creativity and collaboration. Instead, it felt like an elaborate demonstration of my irrelevance. Marcus had structured the sessions around themes of innovation and transformation, with breakout groups focused on emerging technologies and evolving consumer behavior. I found myself assigned to a group discussing traditional marketing foundations, while the other groups explored exciting topics like artificial intelligence applications and influencer partnership strategy. Our group's discussions felt perfunctory, like we were cataloging museum pieces rather than developing strategies for the future. During the closing presentation, each group shared their insights and recommendations. The AI group proposed exciting pilot programs. The influencer team outlined innovative partnership models. When our group presented our analysis of traditional marketing foundations, the room listened politely, but I could feel the energy drain away like air from a punctured balloon. Marcus thanked us all for our contributions and outlined his vision for the coming year. It was ambitious and exciting, full of cutting-edge approaches and strategic partnerships that would position the company for exponential growth. But as he spoke about team structure and leadership roles, it became clear that the future he envisioned had been designed around my absence. I sat in the lodge that night, looking out at snow-covered peaks and trying to process what I'd witnessed. The company I'd helped build was thriving, evolving, and growing beyond anything I'd imagined when I first walked through those glass doors 12 years ago. But it was doing so without me, as if I were a foundation that had served its purpose and could now be built over. The drive back to the city the next morning was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the presentations we'd heard and the direction we were heading. I stared out the window at the landscape rushing past and realized that I'd been passengers in my own career for months, watching destinations approach without having any say in where we were going. When we returned to the office, Marcus scheduled individual meetings with each team member to discuss their roles in implementing the strategic initiatives we'd outlined. My meeting was scheduled for late Friday afternoon, a time slot that spoke volumes about priority and importance. I spent the week preparing for that conversation, organizing my thoughts and developing proposals for how I could contribute to the new initiative. I researched artificial intelligence applications in marketing, studied case studies of successful digital transformations, and prepared detailed analyses of how my experience could enhance the innovative approaches we'd discussed. But when Friday afternoon arrived and I sat across from Marcus in his office, I could see in his eyes that none of my preparation mattered. He'd already made his decision, probably months ago. The meeting was just a formality, a professional courtesy extended to someone who'd served the company well, but had reached the end of her usefulness. "Stella," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "I want you to know how much I've valued your contributions over the years. You've been instrumental in building this company into what it is today." Past tense. Everything was past tense now, as if I were already gone, as if this conversation were a memorial service rather than a strategic planning session. I listened as he outlined the company's evolution, his vision for the future, and the difficult decisions that growth sometimes require. He spoke about restructuring and efficiency, about the need to align resources with strategic priorities, about the challenging realities of remaining competitive in a rapidly changing marketplace. The words washed over me like cold rain, each phrase a polite diminishment of everything I'd built and contributed. I sat perfectly still, maintaining the professional composure that had served me throughout my career, while inside I felt something fundamental beginning to shift. When he finally delivered the sentence about restructuring and space, I wasn't surprised, devastated, but not surprised. The groundwork had been laid over months of small exclusions and gentle dismissals, tiny cuts that had bled me slowly until this final blow could be delivered with clean efficiency. I nodded and asked appropriate questions about timing and transition procedure. I maintained my dignity and grace, thanking him for the opportunities I'd been given, and expressing support for the company's continued success. I shook his hand and walked out of his office with my head high and my heart breaking. But as I cleared out my desk that evening, packing 12 years of memories and achievements into cardboard boxes, I felt something besides grief and disappointment stirring in my chest. It was small and quiet at first, like the barely audible hum of a machine starting up after a long period of dormancy. It was anger, clean and sharp and powerful, not the explosive kind that burns hot and fast, but the steady kind that builds pressure slowly and changes everything in its path. I'd been discarded like an outdated piece of equipment, dismissed as if my experience and expertise were liabilities rather than assets. They'd made their choice about my value, about my place, about my future. Now it was time for me to make some choices of my own. The severance package was generous, Marcus assured me, as if generosity could cushion the blow of being erased from the life I'd spent over a decade building. 3 months' salary, continued health insurance for 6 months, and a letter of recommendation that praised my dedication while carefully avoiding any mention of my strategic capabilities or leadership potential. It was the kind of package designed to ease corporate guilt rather than acknowledge actual value. I signed the papers in the sterile conference room where I'd presented countless campaigns and celebrated numerous victories. The same room where I'd helped secure million-dollar contracts and solve impossible client challenges now witnessed my professional execution, carried out with the clinical efficiency of a medical procedure. Marcus handed me a pen, the same Mont Blanc I'd helped him choose years ago, and I used it to sign away my claim to the company I'd helped build from 6 employees to 60. The non-compete clause was particularly insulting, though I understood why they'd included it. For 18 months I was prohibited from working for any competing marketing firm within a 50-mile radius, and I couldn't solicit any current clients for my own venture. They were ensuring that the institutional knowledge I carried, the relationships I'd cultivated, and the expertise I'd developed would benefit no one but Rodriguez Marketing Solutions, even as they deemed that same knowledge obsolete. Walking out of that building for the last time felt surreal, like leaving a movie theater after an unexpectedly tragic film. The security guard Miguel, who'd greeted me every morning for years with updates about his grandson's baseball games, looked confused when I handed over my access card and building keys. "Taking a vacation, Ms. Rodriguez?" he asked using the coincidental name that had once felt like destiny. "Something like that," I replied, unable to explain that I was being permanently vacated from a place that had defined my identity for over a third of my adult life. I drove home in my reliable Honda Civic, the same car I'd been driving for 8 years because I'd never seen the need to upgrade when everything else in my life felt stable and secure. The afternoon traffic moved with its usual sluggish predictability, but I felt disconnected from the familiar rhythm of the commute, like I was watching someone else's life through tinted glass. My house, when I pulled into the driveway, looked smaller somehow, as if it had shrunk in proportion to my diminished circumstances. The little bungalow that had been my sanctuary now felt like a place where unemployed 53-year-old women went to disappear quietly into irrelevance. I sat in the car for several minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, trying to summon the energy to walk inside and begin whatever came next. The first few days passed in a haze of practical necessities and emotional numbness. I updated my resume, a document I hadn't touched in over a decade, struggling to translate 12 years of growth and achievement into bullet points that would make sense to strangers. How do you quantify the trust of long-term clients? How do you measure the value of institutional knowledge? How do you explain that you weren't just an employee but a foundational element of everything the company had become? I applied for unemployment benefits, standing in line at a government office filled with people whose stories of job loss and economic displacement felt both familiar and foreign. The clerk who processed my paperwork was efficient but impersonal, reducing my career to a series of forms and verification numbers that would determine my monthly assistance payment. The amount was roughly a quarter of my former salary, enough to cover basic expenses but not enough to maintain the life I'd built. My sister Carmen called every few days, her voice carefully cheerful as she offered encouragement and practical suggestions. "This could be a blessing in disguise," she said during one particularly difficult conversation. "Maybe it's time to try something completely different. You could travel, take up painting, maybe even write that marketing book you used to talk about." But I wasn't ready for silver linings or creative opportunities. I was still processing the betrayal, still trying to understand how 12 years of exemplary service could be dismissed so easily. I wasn't looking for new adventures. I was mourning the loss of an identity that had been stripped away without warning or apparent cause. The worst moments came in the early mornings when my body clock still woke me at 6:15, ready to begin another day of purposeful work. I'd lie in bed listening to the silence where there should have been the urgency of preparation, the mental review of the day's priorities, the anticipation of problems to solve and relationships to nurture. Instead, there was just empty time stretching ahead with no structure or meaning. I tried to maintain routines, rising at the same time and dressing professionally even though I had nowhere professional to go. I'd make coffee and sit at my kitchen table with my laptop, scrolling through job postings that seemed to require either decades more experience or decades less age. The marketing industry, I discovered, had apparently evolved beyond my ability to contribute meaningfully, despite the fact that consumer psychology and relationship building hadn't fundamentally changed since I'd started my career. The job interviews I managed to secure were exercises in polite humiliation. Hiring managers, many of them younger than some of my favorite blazers, would review my resume with expressions that mixed respect for my experience with doubt about my relevance. They'd ask about my familiarity with platforms I'd never heard of, my comfort level with concepts that seemed to change faster than seasonal fashion trends, my ability to think disruptively about challenges I'd been solving successfully for years. One particularly memorable interview was with a startup called BrandSpark, housed in a converted warehouse where 20-something employees worked at standing desks surrounded by inspirational wall decals about innovation and authenticity. The hiring manager, an earnest young man named Tyler who wore designer sneakers with his business casual attire, spent 30 minutes explaining their revolutionary approach to customer engagement that sounded remarkably similar to relationship marketing principles I'd been implementing since before he'd graduated high school. "We're looking for someone who can bring fresh perspective to traditional paradigms," Tyler explained, using the word paradigm with the confidence of someone who'd recently discovered it. "Someone who isn't constrained by how things have always been done in the industry." I nodded and smiled, asking thoughtful questions about their target demographics and campaign objectives, while internally cataloging the ways their revolutionary approach could benefit from the kind of strategic foundation I'd spent my career developing. But I could see in Tyler's eyes the same look I'd grown familiar with over the past months: polite appreciation for my experience coupled with certainty that experience wasn't what they needed. "We'll be in touch," he said at the end of our conversation, shaking my hand with the kind of firm grip that young professionals practice to convey authority. We both knew they wouldn't be in touch, but the ritual of professional courtesy demanded the pretense. After 6 weeks of similar encounters, I stopped applying for marketing positions altogether. The industry had apparently moved beyond my ability to contribute, or at least beyond its willingness to invest in helping experienced professionals adapt to new methodology. I expanded my search to administrative roles, customer service positions, even retail management jobs that would utilize my organizational skills and people-focused approach. But these interviews brought their own challenge. Employers were suspicious of my overqualification, worried that I'd leave as soon as something better came along. They questioned whether someone with my background would be satisfied with entry-level responsibilities, whether I could take direction from supervisors who might be significantly younger, whether I'd be able to adapt to company cultures that had evolved beyond my experience level. I assured them of my flexibility and commitment, emphasizing my work ethic and reliability, while carefully downplaying the leadership experience that apparently made me threatening rather than valuable. But the conversations felt like elaborate performances where I was auditioning for the role of diminished version of myself, convincing strangers that I was grateful for the opportunity to start over at the bottom of career ladders I'd already climbed successfully. The rejections arrived with predictable regularity, usually in the form of brief emails that thanked me for my interest while explaining that they'd chosen to move forward with other candidates. A few included encouraging language about keeping my resume on file for future opportunities, but I recognized these as the professional equivalent of "let's just be friends," polite dismissals designed to end the relationship without unnecessary pain. My savings account, which had felt comfortably substantial when I'd been earning a steady salary, began to shrink with alarming speed. Mortgage payments, utilities, insurance premiums, and basic living expenses consumed the unemployment benefits and required regular withdrawals from the emergency fund I'd built over years of careful financial planning. I found myself calculating how long my money would last at current spending levels, then recalculating with reduced expenses, then recalculating again with increasingly drastic budget cuts. The house that had been my sanctuary began to feel like an expensive burden. The mortgage payment that had seemed manageable on my former salary now consumed nearly 2/3 of my monthly income. I considered refinancing, but banks weren't eager to work with unemployed 53-year-old applicants, regardless of their credit history or equity position. I researched selling, but the real estate market was sluggish, and I'd likely lose money on a property I'd hoped to pay off before retirement. I started implementing small economies that felt like incremental surrender. I canceled subscription services I'd enjoyed, switched to generic brands at the grocery store, and began driving only when absolutely necessary to conserve gas. I stopped buying clothes, stopped eating at restaurants, stopped purchasing the small luxuries that had made working long hours feel worthwhile. Each cut felt reasonable in isolation, but collectively they represented the systematic dismantling of the life I'd built. The isolation was perhaps worse than the financial pressure. Without the daily structure of work, without colleagues to interact with and problems to solve, my world became very small very quickly. I'd underestimated how much of my social connection had been tied to my professional identity, how many of my friendships had been built around shared work experiences and industry conversation. Former colleagues stayed in touch sporadically, sending brief text messages asking how I was doing and promising to meet for coffee soon, but these promises rarely materialized into actual plans, and when they did, the conversations felt strained and artificial. They'd update me on office news with careful enthusiasm, sharing developments and changes that reminded me how quickly I'd become irrelevant to the daily operations I'd once considered essential. Jessica called a few times in the early weeks, her voice bright with the energy of someone thriving in the role I'd been forced to vacate. She asked thoughtful questions about client histories and relationship dynamics, clearly trying to honor my contributions while establishing her own approach to account management. I appreciated her consideration, but the conversations left me feeling like a consultant to my own former life, offering guidance on problems I was no longer allowed to solve direct. Marcus sent a formal email after my first month away, acknowledging my contributions and expressing hope that I was finding fulfillment in new opportunities. The message was professional and appropriately gracious, but it felt like communication from a distant acquaintance rather than someone I'd worked alongside for over a decade. He mentioned that the company was doing well, that several new initiatives were showing promise, that the team was adapting successfully to the restructuring. He didn't ask about my job search or offer any assistance with networking or reference. I crafted several responses to his email, ranging from gracious acknowledgement to pointed observations about the industry connections and institutional knowledge I'd taken with me. In the end, I sent a brief reply thanking him for the update and wishing continued success for the company. There was nothing productive to be gained from burning bridges, even if those bridges had already been demolished from the other side. The days began to blur together, in a haze of job applications, budget calculations, and mounting anxiety about the future. I'd wake each morning with the best intentions of maintaining productivity and optimism, but by afternoon I'd often find myself sitting at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop screen without really seeing it, paralyzed by the enormity of rebuilding a career and identity from scratch, at an age when most people were thinking about retirement planning rather than professional reinvention. Carmen visited on a particularly difficult Saturday, finding me still in my bathrobe at 2 in the afternoon, surrounded by printed job listings and crumpled rejection emails. She took one look at my state and immediately began organizing what she called an intervention, though it felt more like an invasion of unwelcome energy and forced optimism. "You're spiraling," she announced, gathering up the job search materials and dumping them in a box. "This isn't helping. You need to get out of this house, get some fresh air. Remember that there's a world beyond employment applications and budget spreadsheets." She dragged me to a nearby hiking trail, chattering about perspective and resilience, while I trudged along the path feeling like I was wearing lead boots. The exercise felt good despite my resistance, and the autumn air carried the kind of crisp clarity that usually lifted my spirits. But even surrounded by natural beauty and sisterly support, I felt disconnected from joy, like I was observing happiness through thick glass. "You're not defined by that job," Carmen said as we sat on a bench, overlooking a small lake. "You had a life before Rodriguez Marketing, and you'll have a life after it. Maybe a better life, one where you're not giving everything to people who don't appreciate your value. I wanted to believe her, but appreciation had never been the point. I'd found meaning in contribution, purpose in problem solving, identity and competence in growth. Without work that mattered, without challenges to meet and relationships to nurture, I felt like a skill set in search of an application, a collection of capabilities with no outlet for expression. I don't know who I am without that work, I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. For 12 years I was someone who solved problems and made things better. Now I'm just someone who used to do those things. Carmen was quiet for a long moment, watching ducks navigate the lake with effortless purpose. Maybe, she said finally, this is your chance to discover who you are beyond what you do. Maybe you've been so busy being essential to everyone else that you forgot to be essential to yourself. The conversation stayed with me as autumn deepened into winter, and my job search continued to yield nothing but polite rejections and uncomfortable interviews. I began to wonder if Carmen was right, if I'd built my entire sense of self around being needed by others, around being the solution to problems I hadn't created. If that was true, then unemployment wasn't just a professional setback, it was an identity crisis that no new job could fully resolve. But I wasn't ready for philosophical transformation. I wanted my life back, or at least a reasonable approximation of the purpose and security I'd lost. I wanted to wake up with somewhere important to go, problems that needed solving, relationships that required nurture. I wanted to feel valuable again, essential again, like my experience and expertise mattered to someone besides my sister and my unemployment counselor. Winter arrived early that year, covering my neighborhood in snow that made everything look clean and quiet, and impossibly remote. I'd sit by my living room window watching my neighbors leave for work in the morning, and return in the evening, their routines a reminder of the rhythm I'd lost. Their lives continued with purpose and structure while mine felt increasingly unmoored, drifting without anchor or destination. I stopped checking my email obsessively, stopped refreshing job search websites multiple times per day, stopped pretending that the next application would be the one that changed everything. The rejections kept coming, but I developed a kind of immunity to their sting. I was no longer surprised by the lack of interest in my qualifications. I'd begun to accept it as an immutable fact of my current reality. It was during this period of resigned acceptance that I made a discovery that would change everything, though I didn't recognize its significance at the time. I was cleaning out old files from my home office, sorting through years of accumulated paperwork and professional materials, when I found a folder labeled Ideas and Innovations that I'd apparently forgotten about completely. Inside were dozens of documents spanning my entire career, campaign concepts I'd developed but never implemented, strategic approaches I'd researched but never proposed, market analysis I'd conducted for my own curiosity rather than any specific client need. Page after page of insights and innovations that had emerged from my work but had never been fully explored or developed. Some of the ideas were clearly outdated, tied to trends or technologies that had evolved beyond relevance, but others felt remarkably current, addressing challenges and opportunities that seemed even more pressing now than when I'd first conceived them. I'd apparently been documenting solutions to problems the industry was just beginning to acknowledge, developing frameworks for approaches that were now being hailed as cutting-edge innovation. One document in particular caught my attention, a comprehensive analysis of authentic relationship marketing in the digital age, that I'd written 3 years earlier during a particularly slow weekend. I'd been thinking about how to maintain genuine human connections in an increasingly automated and algorithm-driven marketing landscape, and I'd outlined strategies for brands to build trust and loyalty through consistent, personalized and value-driven communication. Reading it now, I realized I'd essentially predicted and proposed solutions for challenges that companies were desperately trying to address with expensive consultants and sophisticated technology platforms. The approaches I'd outlined were elegant in their simplicity: deep customer research, strategic storytelling, consistent value delivery, and genuine relationship building over time. It wasn't revolutionary in the sense of being completely unprecedented, but it was revolutionary in its integration of traditional relationship principles with contemporary digital capability. I'd identified ways to scale personal connection, to use technology to enhance, rather than replace human insight, to build sustainable competitive advantages, through authentic engagement rather than manipulative tactics. As I read through more of the documents, a pattern emerged. I'd been solving problems and developing innovations throughout my career, but I'd been implementing them within the constraints of existing organizational structures and client relationships. I'd been improving other people's businesses instead of creating my own, enhancing other people's visions instead of pursuing my own ideas with full creative freedom. For the first time in months, I felt something besides resignation and anxiety stirring in my chest. It was small and tentative, like the first green shoots pushing through snow, but it was unmistakably hope. Not hope for someone else to recognize my value, but hope that I might be able to create value independent of anyone else's validation or approval. I spent the next several days reading through every document in that folder, taking notes and making connections between ideas I'd developed years apart. I began to see not just individual insights, but a comprehensive philosophy of marketing that emphasized authenticity, relationship building, and sustainable growth over quick wins and superficial engagement. More importantly, I began to see a business model that could implement these ideas without requiring anyone's permission or approval. I could create my own consulting practice, develop my own client relationships, and build my own reputation based on results, rather than resume credentials or age demographics. The possibility was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I had no experience running my own business, no existing client base to draw from, and no financial cushion to support the inevitable startup period. But I also had no boss to convince, no organizational politics to navigate, and no ceiling on my potential impact or income. For the first time since Marcus had delivered his restructuring speech, I felt like I might have some control over my professional future. Not just the hope of finding another job, but the possibility of creating work that would be entirely my own, built around my strengths and experience, rather than constrained by other people's limitations or bias. I closed the folder and sat back in my chair, looking around my home office with new eyes. Instead of seeing a space where unemployed people sent futile job applications, I saw the potential headquarters of something that didn't exist yet but could, with enough courage and determination and strategic thinking. The woman who had been discarded for being too old, too experienced, too rooted in traditional approaches, was about to discover that those very qualities might be exactly what the market needed. But first, she had to find the courage to bet everything on herself. The decision didn't come all at once like a lightning bolt of inspiration. Instead, it built slowly over several weeks of careful consideration, like a tide that rises so gradually you don't notice until the shoreline has completely changed. I found myself returning to that folder of forgotten ideas again and again, each reading revealing new possibilities and connections I hadn't initially recognized. I started by researching the consulting landscape, spending hours online studying established firms and independent practitioners, analyzing their service offerings and pricing structures, trying to understand how the market had evolved since I'd last paid attention to it, as a potential competitor rather than a career option. What I discovered was both encouraging and daunting. The industry was indeed saturated with young firms promising digital transformation and cutting-edge strategies, but their approaches often felt superficial, focused on tactics, rather than genuine relationship building. They could optimize ad spending and track conversion metrics with impressive precision, but they struggled with the deeper challenges of brand authenticity and long-term customer loyalty that had always been my specialty. More importantly, I began to notice a counter-trend emerging in the business literature and conference presentations I researched. Companies were beginning to recognize that pure digital strategies, while efficient, often lack the human connection that builds lasting customer relationships. There was growing interest in what industry publications called relationship renaissance and authentic engagement strategies, approaches that sounded remarkably similar to the methodologies I'd been developing and refining for over a decade. The market analysis I conducted over several evenings revealed a significant gap between what companies said they wanted and what most consulting firms were actually delivering. Everyone talked about building authentic relationships with customers, but most were implementing automated systems and algorithmic targeting that felt impersonal and manipulative to consumers who were becoming increasingly sophisticated about marketing tactics. I began to see my experience not as outdated baggage, but as rare expertise in approaches that were becoming more valuable rather than less relevant. The relationship-building skills I'd developed, the customer psychology insights I'd accumulated, the strategic frameworks I'd created for authentic engagement were not obsolete. They were exactly what companies needed to differentiate themselves in an increasingly crowded and skeptical marketplace. The financial analysis was more challenging. Starting a consulting practice would require minimal initial investment compared to other types of businesses, but it would also mean no income for several months, while I built a client base and established credibility. My savings could support basic living expenses for perhaps 6 months if I was careful, which would give me time to develop proposals and secure initial contracts. I created detailed spreadsheets calculating different scenarios, from conservative projections that assumed slow client acquisition to optimistic models that factored in referrals and contract renewal. Even the conservative estimates suggested that a successful practice could generate significantly more income than my former salary within 18 months, while the optimistic projections pointed toward financial independence I'd never imagined possible as an employee. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real calculation involved risk tolerance and personal resilience, qualities I'd never had to test at this scale. Was I prepared to exhaust my savings on a venture that might fail completely? Could I handle the uncertainty of irregular income and the pressure of being solely responsible for my own success? Did I have the emotional stamina to rebuild my professional identity from scratch at an age when most people were beginning to think about winding down their career? I spent a particularly sleepless night wrestling with these questions, staring at my bedroom ceiling while scenarios played out in my imagination. I pictured myself 18 months in the future, either celebrating the success of a thriving consulting practice, or explaining to Carmen why I'd burned through my retirement savings on a midlife fantasy that had predictably collapsed under the weight of reality. The next morning, I called my financial advisor, a sensible woman named Patricia who'd been helping me manage my investments for several years. I explained my situation carefully, outlining both the potential opportunity and the significant risks involved in starting my own business. Patricia listened without judgment, asking practical questions about cash flow projections and risk mitigation strategies. "Your financial position is solid enough to support this kind of venture," she said finally, "but only if you're realistic about timelines and conservative about expense. You'd need to treat this like a serious business investment, not an expensive hobby." She helped me restructure my savings to create a dedicated business fund that could support operations for 8 months without touching my core retirement investment. She also recommended establishing a strict monthly budget that would force me to achieve profitability quickly rather than gradually depleting my resources, while hoping for eventual success. "The biggest risk isn't financial," she warned as we concluded our meeting. "It's psychological. Running your own business requires a completely different mindset than being an employee. You'll need to be comfortable with uncertainty, rejection, and the constant pressure of generating your own opportunities." Her warning stayed with me as I began the practical work of business formation. I researched legal structures and tax implications, eventually deciding on a limited liability company that would provide personal protection while maintaining operational flexibility. I worked with an attorney to draft operating agreements and establish proper record-keeping systems, investing in the kind of professional foundation that would support sustainable growth. Choosing a business name proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. I wanted something that conveyed expertise and trustworthiness, without sounding outdated or overly traditional. After considering dozens of options, I settled on Authentic Strategies Consulting, a name that captured both my focus on genuine relationship building and my comprehensive approach to business challenge. The logo design process forced me to think carefully about brand identity and market positioning, skills I'd developed for clients but had never applied to my own professional image. I worked with a freelance designer to create visual elements that felt both sophisticated and approachable, contemporary but not trendy, professional without being intimidating. Setting up the home office required converting my spare bedroom into a professional workspace that could accommodate client meetings and video conferences. I invested in proper lighting, a high-quality camera setup, and furniture that projected competence and success. The transformation felt symbolic, marking the physical transition from unemployed job seeker to independent business owner. The website development consumed several weeks of intensive work, but it became the foundation for everything that followed. I wrote detailed service descriptions that explained my methodologies, without revealing proprietary strategies, created case studies that demonstrated results without violating former clients' confidentiality, and developed resource materials that showcased my expertise while providing genuine value to potential customers. The content strategy reflected years of accumulated knowledge about what actually worked in building customer relationships versus what marketing firms typically promise to deliver. Instead of focusing on trendy buzzwords and sophisticated technical capabilities, I emphasized outcomes that business owners could understand and measure: increased customer loyalty, improved referral rates, sustainable competitive advantages, and profitable long-term growth. I also created a blog that would establish thought leadership and demonstrate my expertise to potential clients who might be researching consulting options. The first few posts were challenging to write, requiring me to distill complex strategic insights into accessible content that would be valuable to readers while establishing my credibility as an expert in authentic relationship marketing. The networking strategy began with reactivating professional connections I'd maintained throughout my career, but it quickly expanded to include industry associations, local business groups, and online communities where potential clients might be seeking consulting services. I attended virtual conferences and webinars, participating in discussions and asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated my expertise without being overtly promotional. One particularly valuable connection came through a local Chamber of Commerce meeting I attended on a Tuesday evening in February. I'd been hesitant to invest time in what I expected to be generic networking and superficial business card exchanges, but the presenter was discussing customer retention challenges that aligned perfectly with my consulting focus. During the question period, I asked about the relationship between employee satisfaction and customer loyalty, sharing insights from my experience about how internal culture affects external relationships. The question sparked an extended discussion that continued after the formal presentation ended, with several business owners approaching me for more detailed conversations about their specific challenges. One of those business owners was Elena Vasquez, the founder of a rapidly growing organic food distributor who was struggling to maintain personal relationships with customers as her company scaled beyond her ability to personally manage every account. She described the exact type of challenge I'd been solving throughout my career: how to systematize relationship building without losing the authentic connection that had driven initial growth. "Everyone keeps telling me I need marketing automation and customer relationship management software," Elena explained as we talked over coffee the following week, "but every system I've looked at feels like it would turn my customers into data points instead of real people. I built this business on trust and personal connection, and I don't want to lose that just because we're growing." Her dilemma was exactly the type of complex strategic challenge that larger consulting firms typically addressed with expensive technology solutions that solved technical problems while creating human relationship problems. I saw immediately how my approach could help her scale personal connection through strategic frameworks and systematic relationship building, using technology to enhance rather than replace human insight. I spent several days developing a comprehensive proposal that outlined specific strategies for maintaining authentic relationships while improving operational efficiency. Instead of recommending expensive software platforms, I suggested process improvements and training programs that would help her team deliver consistent, personalized service at scale. The proposal included detailed implementation timelines, measurable outcomes, and a fee structure that tied my compensation directly to results rather than just time invested. I wanted Elena to understand that I was confident enough in my methodologies to bet my own income on their effectiveness. When I presented the proposal the following week, Elena's reaction exceeded my most optimistic expectations. "This is exactly what I've been looking for," she said, reviewing the strategic framework I'd outlined. "Everyone else wants to automate the relationship building, but you're showing me how to systematize it while keeping it personal. When can we start?" The contract negotiations were straightforward, partly because my proposal had been thorough enough to address most of her questions and concerns before they arose. We agreed on a 6-month engagement with clearly defined milestones and deliverables, along with performance bonuses tied to specific customer satisfaction and retention improvements. Signing that first contract felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. I was no longer someone who used to work in marketing. I was someone who owned a marketing consulting practice with a real client and specific obligations to deliver measurable results. The shift in identity was subtle but profound, changing how I introduced myself and how I thought about my professional capabilities. The work itself was exhilarating in a way I hadn't experienced since my earliest days at Rodriguez Marketing Solutions. I had complete creative freedom to develop solutions that I believed would be most effective, without having to navigate organizational politics or compromise my recommendations to fit existing systems or corporate preferences. I developed a comprehensive customer relationship audit that identified specific touchpoints where Elena's company could strengthen connections with clients, created training materials that helped her sales team deliver consistent value-added service, and designed feedback systems that would provide ongoing intelligence about customer satisfaction and loyalty. The implementation process required intensive collaboration with Elena's team, but they were enthusiastic about approaches that enhanced, rather than replaced, their existing relationship-building effort. Unlike my experience with Marcus's innovation team, these conversations were energizing and productive, focused on practical problem-solving rather than theoretical disruption. Within 6 weeks of beginning the engagement, Elena's customer satisfaction scores had improved measurably, and her customer retention rates were showing encouraging trends. More importantly, her team reported feeling more confident and effective in their client interactions, equipped with systematic approaches that supported their natural relationship-building instinct. The success with Elena's company generated exactly the kind of results-based credibility I needed to attract additional clients. She referred me to 2 other business owners facing similar challenges, and both engagements led to successful outcomes and further referral. Within 4 months, I had a waiting list of potential clients and was beginning to turn down projects that didn't align with my strategic focus. The financial results exceeded even my optimistic projection. By month 6, my monthly income was substantially higher than my former salary, and the trajectory suggested continued growth as my reputation and referral network expanded. More importantly, the profit margins were significantly better than anything I could have achieved as an employee, since I was capturing the full value of my expertise rather than sharing it with an employer. But the transformation went beyond financial success or even professional satisfaction. For the first time in my career, I was building something that was entirely my own, creating value through approaches that reflected my beliefs about authentic relationship building rather than implementing strategies designed by other people or constrained by organizational limitations. I found myself working longer hours than I had as an employee, but the work felt energizing rather than draining because every effort was an investment in my own vision rather than someone else's company. The challenges were more complex and the pressure was more intense, but the autonomy and creative freedom made every difficulty feel worthwhile. The most unexpected benefit was the confidence that came from proving my value in the marketplace rather than within a single organization. When Elena's competitors began seeking similar consulting services, when industry publications started requesting interviews about authentic relationship marketing strategies, when other consultants began studying my methodology, I realized that my expertise had market value that extended far beyond any individual employer's recognition. I also began to understand how much my thinking had been constrained by working within existing organizational structure. As an employee, I'd been solving problems within parameters set by other people, optimizing systems that had been designed by others, improving processes that reflected other people's strategic vision. As an independent consultant, I could design completely new approaches that maximized effectiveness rather than organizational convenience. The insights I developed through this unrestricted problem-solving began to coalesce into a comprehensive methodology that was genuinely innovative, not just in terms of tactical implementation, but in its fundamental approach to customer relationship building. I was creating intellectual property that could form the foundation for a much larger business opportunity. By the end of my first year in business, I was no longer just a successful consultant. I was someone who had developed proprietary strategies that were generating significant market interest. Industry associations were inviting me to speak at conferences, business publications were featuring my approaches in case studies, and larger companies were beginning to inquire about licensing my methodologies for their own organization. The woman who had been deemed too old and too traditional by Rodriguez Marketing Solutions had become a recognized expert in cutting-edge relationship marketing strategies. The experience I'd accumulated over decades of client work had been transformed into competitive advantages that couldn't be replicated by younger consultants with superior technical skills, but inferior strategic insight. More importantly, I discovered that being discarded by one organization had freed me to create value that no single employer could have contained or fully utilized. The limitation had never been my capabilities. It had been my willingness to constrain those capabilities within other people's visions of what was possible or profitable. As my first year in business concluded, I began developing plans for expansion that would have been unimaginable when I'd been clearing out my desk at Rodriguez Marketing Solutions. Instead of looking for another job that would provide security and stability, I was building a business that could provide independence and unlimited growth potential. The transformation was complete, but the real test was still ahead. Building a successful consulting practice was one achievement. Scaling it into something that could fundamentally change the industry was an entirely different challenge. But for the first time in my professional life, I felt capable of attempting something truly ambitious, rather than just competently managing other people's ambitions. The foundation was solid, the methodology was proven, and the market opportunity was substantial. Now it was time to discover exactly how much space I could claim in an industry that had once insisted there was no space for me at all. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 18 months after I'd walked out of Rodriguez Marketing Solutions for the last time. I was in my home office, reviewing proposals for what had become a thriving consulting practice, when my assistant Maria forwarded a call from someone who claimed to represent a major client seeking strategic consulting services. Rodriguez, the voice was polished and professional, though unfamiliar. My name is David Kim, and I'm the business development director for a marketing firm that's interested in discussing a potential partnership opportunity. We've been following your work in the industry, and we're impressed by the results you've been achieving for your clients. I listened with practiced patience as David outlined what sounded like a standard consulting inquiry. His company was experiencing challenges with client retention and was looking for expertise in relationship marketing strategies. They'd heard about my methodologies through industry connections and wanted to explore whether there might be opportunities for collaboration. "What's the name of your firm?" I asked, though something in his tone had already triggered my suspicions. There was a brief pause before he answered. "Rodriguez Marketing Solutions." The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. The company that had restructured me out of existence was now seeking my services as an external consultant, apparently unaware that the expertise they were trying to purchase was the same expertise they deemed obsolete just over a year ago. "I see," I said carefully, maintaining professional composure while my mind raced through the implications. "And who specifically would I be working with on this engagement?" "The project would be overseen by our senior leadership team," David replied, "including our president, Marcus Chen. I believe you might be familiar with our organization." Familiar was an understatement, but I kept my response neutral. "Yes, I'm familiar with your company. Why don't you send me some information about the specific challenges you're facing, and I'll review whether this might be a good fit for my practice." After ending the call, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. The company that had told me there was no space for my expertise was now actively seeking to purchase that same expertise at rates that were significantly higher than my former salary. The transformation was complete, but the real reckoning was just beginning. I spent the next few days researching Rodriguez Marketing Solutions' current situation, using industry contacts and public information to understand what had driven them to seek external consulting. What I discovered was both enlightening and deeply satisfying. The company had indeed grown significantly since my departure, adding new clients and expanding into additional markets just as Marcus had envisioned. But that growth had come with unexpected costs. Client retention rates had declined substantially, with several major accounts terminating contracts due to what they described as impersonal service and lack of strategic continuity. The young team that Marcus had assembled was technically proficient and creatively innovative, but they struggled with the relationship management aspects that had always been my specialty. They could create impressive campaigns and deliver measurable short-term results, but they hadn't developed the institutional knowledge and client insight that builds long-term partnerships. More telling were the industry reputation challenges that had begun to emerge. Former clients were sharing feedback about their experiences with Rodriguez Marketing Solutions, and the themes were remarkably consistent. Excellent initial work that gradually degraded over time, promising strategies that failed to deliver sustainable results, and account management that felt more transactional than strategic. The company was succeeding in winning new business, but failing to build the kind of lasting relationships that generate referrals and contract renewal. They were growing through expensive business development efforts rather than organic expansion, a model that was both financially unsustainable and strategically vulnerable. Jessica Kim, who had taken over many of my former responsibilities, had left the company 6 months earlier to join a competing firm. According to my sources, her departure had been preceded by increasing frustration with what she described as a lack of strategic direction and insufficient support for relationship building. 2 other senior staff members had followed her, taking valuable client knowledge and relationships with them. The picture that emerged was of a company that had optimized for short-term growth at the expense of long-term sustainability. Exactly the kind of strategic imbalance that my consulting practice was designed to address. They needed someone who could help them rebuild the relationship foundation they'd systematically dismantled in pursuit of efficiency and scale. I took my time crafting a response to David's inquiry, developing a comprehensive analysis of their challenges and a detailed proposal for addressing them. But instead of submitting a standard consulting proposal, I decided to demonstrate exactly how much my perspective had evolved since my days as their employee. The document I created was part strategic assessment, part methodology outline, and part demonstration of intellectual property they'd never had access to, despite my 12 years of employment. I outlined their retention challenges with the precision of someone who understood their operations intimately, then presented solutions that were both sophisticated and practical. The relationship audit framework I proposed was similar to what I'd implemented for Elena and other clients, but I'd refined it significantly based on months of real-world application and continuous improvement. The client segmentation strategies reflected insights I'd developed through working with diverse organizations across multiple industries. The retention optimization approaches incorporated methodologies I'd created specifically for companies struggling with the exact problems Rodriguez Marketing Solutions was facing. Most importantly, I structured the proposal to highlight the gap between their current challenges and the expertise they'd let walk out their door. Every solution I recommended implicitly demonstrated knowledge and capabilities they'd had access to, but had chosen not to utilize. Every strategic insight subtly emphasized the institutional wisdom they'd discarded in favor of fresh perspectives and younger energy. The fee structure I proposed was substantial, reflecting both the complexity of their challenges and the market value of my expertise. I was no longer the cooperative employee willing to work for whatever salary they deemed appropriate. I was an independent consultant whose services commanded premium rates because of their proven effective. When I submitted the proposal, I included a cover letter that was professional but pointed. Based on my analysis of your current situation, I wrote, it appears that Rodriguez Marketing Solutions is experiencing the kind of relationship management challenges that can significantly impact long-term growth and profitability. I believe my expertise in authentic relationship marketing could help address these issues, though the scope of work required would be substantial. The response came within 48 hours, much faster than I'd expected. Marcus himself called, his voice carrying a mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed desperation that was deeply satisfying to hear. Stella, he began, and I noticed he'd dropped the formal Rodriguez that David had used. I received your proposal, and I have to say it's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need right now. Your analysis of our challenges is remarkably accurate because I'd been warning about these exact problems for months before my departure, I thought, but I kept my response measured. I'm glad you found the assessment helpful. The issues you're facing are complex, but they're definitely addressable with the right approach. I'd like to discuss this further. Marcus continued, would you be available for a meeting next week? I think it would be beneficial to explore this opportunity in person. I agreed to the meeting, though I insisted it take place at my office rather than their location. The symbolism was important. They would be coming to me, seeking my expertise on my terms rather than expecting me to accommodate their preferences and convenience. The week leading up to the meeting allowed me to prepare thoroughly, not just for the strategic discussions, but for the psychological dynamics that would inevitably be part of our conversation. This wasn't just a potential consulting engagement, it was a complete reversal of the power relationship that had existed during my employment. I was no longer the grateful employee hoping to maintain Marcus's approval and support. I was an established consultant whose expertise was in demand, who could choose which clients to work with based on strategic fit and professional satisfaction, rather than financial necessity. The transformation in perspective was profound and deeply empowering. When Marcus arrived at my office the following Tuesday, I could see immediately that the dynamics had shifted in ways that went beyond our changed professional relationship. He looked older, more tired, carrying the weight of leadership challenges that had apparently proven more difficult than he'd anticipated. The confident entrepreneur who had once explained market evolution to me now seemed uncertain and somewhat defensive. "Your office is impressive," he said, looking around at the space I'd carefully designed to project competence and success. "You've obviously built something substantial here." "Thank you," I replied, gesturing for him to sit in the client chair across from my desk. The arrangement was deliberate. I was clearly in the position of authority. He was the one seeking assistance. I've been fortunate to work with some excellent clients who appreciate strategic relationship marketing. We spent the first part of our meeting discussing their current challenges in detail, and I found myself in the peculiar position of listening to Marcus describe problems I could have predicted with remarkable accuracy, based on the trajectory I'd observed before my departure. The young team he'd assembled was struggling with exactly the kinds of complex client relationships that require institutional knowledge and experienced judgment. "We're losing clients we should be able to keep," he admitted, his frustration evident. "The work is good, sometimes excellent, but we're not building the kind of lasting partnerships that generate referrals and renewals. It's like we're starting from scratch with every relationship instead of building on previous success." I nodded sympathetically while internally noting that this was precisely the outcome I'd warned him about during our last few conversations as employee and employee. The relationship capital I'd spent 12 years accumulating had walked out the door with me, and they'd apparently underestimated how difficult it would be to rebuild that foundation with a completely new team. "Relationship building is both an art and a science," I explained, using language I'd refined through months of consulting presentations. "It requires systematic approaches combined with intuitive understanding of human psychology and business dynamics. It's not something that can be automated or delegated to junior staff without proper training and strategic oversight." Marcus leaned forward, clearly engaged by the conversation in a way that reminded me of our early collaborations when he still valued my strategic input. "Your proposal mentions a comprehensive relationship audit. Can you walk me through what that would involve?" I spent the next hour outlining the methodologies I'd developed, explaining how the audit would identify specific gaps in their current approach and provide actionable strategies for improvement. I described case studies from other clients, being careful to maintain confidentiality, while demonstrating the measurable results my approaches had achieved. What was most satisfying was watching Marcus realize that the expertise he was now eager to purchase was the same expertise he'd had access to for over a decade, but had chosen to overlook in favor of innovation and disruption. Every strategy I described was an evolution of approaches I'd been developing and implementing throughout my tenure as his employee. "This is exactly what we need," he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of enthusiasm he used to reserve for potential client acquisition. "How quickly could you begin this engagement?" I paused, savoring the moment when I could demonstrate exactly how much the power dynamic had shifted. "My calendar is quite full through the end of the year," I said truthfully, "but I might be able to accommodate this project if we can structure it appropriately." The fee discussion that followed was particularly rewarding. The daily rate I quoted was more than double my former per-day salary as their employee, and the scope of work I outlined would generate revenue equivalent to nearly 2 years of my previous annual compensation. Marcus didn't even attempt to negotiate. apparently recognizing that my expertise was now a scarce commodity available only at market rate. But the real satisfaction came from the consulting agreement we developed, which gave me complete authority over the strategic approach and implementation timeline. Instead of having my recommendations filtered through organizational politics and competing priorities, I would be working directly with clients and staff to implement proven methodologies without interference or compromise. The irony was delicious. Rodriguez Marketing Solutions was essentially paying me to fix problems that had been created by ignoring my expertise, and they were doing so at rates that reflected the true market value of the knowledge they'd previously taken for granted. The 6-month engagement that followed was one of the most professionally satisfying periods of my career. I had complete creative freedom to implement strategies I'd been developing for years, along with the authority to make changes that had been impossible when I was constrained by employee status and organizational hierarchy. Working with their current team was enlightening in ways I hadn't expected. The junior staff members were indeed talented and technically sophisticated, but they lacked the relationship management experience that comes only from years of navigating complex client dynamics. I found myself in the role of teacher and mentor, sharing insights about customer psychology and strategic communication that couldn't be learned from textbooks or digital marketing courses. Jessica's replacement, a bright young woman named Sarah, was particularly receptive to learning what she called the relationship secrets that had made me successful. "You understand something about client management that they don't teach in business school," she said during one of our training sessions. "It's like you can predict what clients need before they know it themselves." What I was really demonstrating was the value of institutional knowledge and experienced judgment, qualities that Marcus had dismissed as outdated but were proving essential for sustainable client relationship. The young team had been optimizing for tactical efficiency without understanding the strategic foundation that makes tactics effective over time. The results spoke for themselves. Within 3 months, client satisfaction scores had improved significantly, and several clients who had been considering contract terminations decided to renew their agreement. More importantly, the referral rate began to increase as clients started recommending Rodriguez Marketing Solutions to their business contacts, something that hadn't happened consistently since my departure. The financial impact was equally impressive. The company's client lifetime value improved substantially as retention rates increased and contract renewals became more predictable. The expensive business development efforts that had been necessary to maintain growth were gradually replaced by organic expansion through satisfied client referral. Marcus was effusive in his praise for the transformation, calling the engagement one of the best investments the company had ever made. "You've given us back something we didn't realize we'd lost," he said during one of our progress meetings. "The relationship foundation that made everything else possible." The statement was particularly ironic, given that he'd been the one who had decided that foundation wasn't worth maintaining, but I simply nodded and accepted his gratitude while privately noting how expensive it had been for him to learn that lesson. As the engagement neared completion, Marcus approached me about extending the consulting relationship or possibly even returning to the company in some kind of senior advisory role. The offer was generous, including equity participation and significant autonomy, but I declined without hesitation. "I appreciate the offer," I told him, "but I've discovered that I prefer the independence of consulting. I can have a greater impact working with multiple organizations than I could within any single company." What I didn't say was that I had no interest in returning to employee status with an organization that had demonstrated so clearly how expendable they considered experienced staff. The consulting relationship had been professionally satisfying and financially rewarding, but it had also reinforced my understanding that my expertise was too valuable to be constrained by anyone else's vision of its worth. The success with Rodriguez Marketing Solutions generated exactly the kind of high-profile case study that established my reputation as the go-to consultant for companies struggling with relationship management challenges. Industry publications featured the turnaround as an example of how strategic consulting could address fundamental business problems that technology alone couldn't solve. More importantly, the engagement validated my belief that the experience I'd accumulated over decades of client work represented genuine competitive advantages that couldn't be replicated by younger consultants with superior technical skills but inferior strategic insight. I wasn't competing on innovation or disruption. I was competing on wisdom and proven effectiveness. The referrals that followed the Rodriguez Marketing Solutions success were substantial and prestigious. Companies across multiple industries sought my expertise for relationship challenges that required exactly the kind of strategic foundation I'd been developing throughout my career. The waiting list for my services extended months into the future, and I was able to become increasingly selective about the clients and projects I accepted. Within 2 years of starting my consulting practice, I had established myself as a recognized expert in authentic relationship marketing, with speaking engagements at major industry conferences and strategic partnerships with organizations that wanted to license my methodologies for their own consulting practices. The financial success exceeded my most optimistic projection. My annual income was now several times what I'd earned as an employee, and the business was generating enough profit to support substantial expansion if I chose to pursue it. More importantly, the intellectual property I'd developed was creating passive income streams through licensing agreements and training programs that would provide financial security well into retirement. But the transformation went deeper than professional recognition or financial achievement. I had discovered that being discarded by one organization had actually freed me to create value that no single employer could have contained or fully utilized. The limitation had never been my capabilities, it had been my willingness to constrain those capabilities within other people's visions of what was possible or profitable. The woman who had been deemed too old and too traditional by Rodriguez Marketing Solutions had become the consultant they desperately needed to solve problems that their innovative young team couldn't address. The experience I'd accumulated, the relationships I'd built, and the insights I'd developed over decades of client work had been transformed into competitive advantages that commanded premium fees in the marketplace. Most satisfying was the knowledge that Marcus and his team now understood exactly what they'd lost when they decided there was no space for my expertise. Every success I achieved as an independent consultant was a reminder of the strategic mistake they'd made in prioritizing youth and innovation over experience and proven effectiveness. The industry recognition that followed was gratifying, but it wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the discovery that I didn't need anyone else's validation or approval to create meaningful work and financial success. I had built something entirely my own, based on my expertise and strategic vision rather than constrained by organizational politics or other people's limitations. 3 years after walking out of Rodriguez Marketing Solutions for the last time, I was invited to speak at the National Marketing Excellence Conference, the most prestigious gathering in our industry. The keynote address I delivered was titled, "The Relationship Renaissance: Why Experience Matters More Than Innovation in Building Sustainable Client Partnerships." The audience included Marcus and several members of his team, who listened as I outlined the methodologies they were now paying premium rates to license from my consulting practice. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in attendance, and the standing ovation I received felt like the final validation of a journey that had begun with rejection and led to recognition as a leading voice in strategic relationship marketing. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came after the presentation, when a young marketing professional approached me with a question about career development. "How do you maintain confidence when everyone seems to value youth and innovation over experience?" she asked. I smiled, remembering the sleepless nights and financial anxiety that had marked my own transition from employee to entrepreneur. "You have to understand that experience isn't the opposite of innovation," I replied. "Real innovation comes from combining deep knowledge with creative problem solving. Don't let anyone convince you that your expertise is outdated just because you've developed it over time. Sometimes the market needs time to catch up with the value you've been creating all along." As I flew home from the conference, looking down at the landscape stretching endlessly below, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from the devastating conversation in Marcus's office to this moment of professional triumph. The path hadn't been predictable or easy, but it had led to discoveries about my own capabilities and market value that I never could have made while constrained by employee status. Rodriguez Marketing Solutions had told me there was no space for my expertise in their organization. In response, I had created my own space in the marketplace, one that was now large enough to contain not just my own practice, but licensing agreements, strategic partnerships, and influence that extended across the entire industry. They had made their choice about my value and my future. I had made my own choices in response, and those choices had led to independence, recognition, and success that exceeded anything I could have achieved within the limitations of their employment structure. The company that had insisted there was no space for me now found themselves competing for space in a market where my expertise had become the standard for authentic relationship marketing. They could access my knowledge and methodologies, but only as clients paying premium rates for services that set the benchmark for excellence in our field. It was a complete reversal of the power dynamic that had once seemed so permanent and immutable. The woman who had been discarded as obsolete had become the expert that everyone, including her former employer, needed to succeed in an increasingly competitive marketplace. The victory wasn't about revenge or vindication, though those elements were undeniably satisfying. The real victory was the discovery that rejection from one opportunity had led to the creation of something far more valuable and sustainable than anything I could have built within the constraints of traditional employment. As my plane descended toward home, I was already thinking about the next phase of expansion for my consulting practice, the new methodologies I was developing, and the strategic partnerships that would allow me to scale my impact even further. The future stretched ahead with possibilities I never could have imagined when I was clearing out my desk in defeat, just a few years earlier. Rodriguez Marketing Solutions had told me they didn't have space for my expertise. In response, I had made sure they no longer had space anywhere in the market without acknowledging the value of what they had discarded. It was a lesson in strategic thinking that would serve them well, though it had cost them far more than the generous severance package they thought had closed our relationship forever. The transformation was complete, but the story was just beginning. The woman who had rebuilt her life once after divorce had done it again after professional rejection, and this time she had built something that was entirely her own, something that no one could restructure, reorganize, or take away, something that would always have space for her expertise, because she had created that space herself. 5 years had passed since that pivotal Tuesday morning when Marcus Chen had delivered the sentence that would change everything. Standing in my corner office on the 32nd floor of the downtown high-rise that now housed Authentic Strategies Consulting headquarters, I could see the building where Rodriguez Marketing Solutions still operates, though their prominence in the skyline seemed diminished from this elevated perspective. The view from here was different in every possible way. Where I had once looked up at other successful businesses from the modest confines of their 2-floor operation, I now looked across at a landscape of opportunity that stretched in every direction. The company I had built occupied an entire floor of premium office space, employed 23 full-time staff members, and maintained strategic partnerships with consulting firms across 3 continents. The transformation had accelerated beyond anything I could have imagined during those early months when I was developing proposals in my converted spare bedroom. What had begun as a survival strategy had evolved into something approaching a revolution in how companies approached customer relationship management, with methodologies I had developed becoming industry standards taught in business schools and implemented by Fortune. The morning mail brought a letter that made me smile with a satisfaction that had never diminished over the years. It was from Stanford Graduate School of Business, inviting me to join their faculty as a visiting professor for their new masterclass series on strategic relationship marketing. The letter referenced my groundbreaking work in authentic customer engagement, and described my methodologies as essential knowledge for the next generation of business leaders. The academic recognition was particularly meaningful because it represented validation from an institution that prioritized intellectual rigor over market trends. These weren't consultants or industry publications praising my work because it generated revenue. These were scholars acknowledging that I had developed approaches that would be studied and refined for decades to come. I set the letter aside and returned to reviewing the quarterly reports that documented just how far Authentic Strategies had progressed. The numbers were impressive, but they told only part of the story. Revenue had grown by 42% over the previous year, driven primarily by expansion into international markets where companies were struggling with the same relationship management challenges I had first identified in my local market. The client roster read like a directory of industry leaders, technology companies seeking to humanize their customer interactions, financial services firms working to rebuild trust after industry scandals, retail brands trying to compete with online giants through superior relationship building, and manufacturing companies discovering that B2B success required the same authentic engagement principles that drove consumer loyalty. But the most satisfying entries in that quarterly report were the companies that had approached us after struggling with other consulting firms that promised innovation but delivered confusion. We had become the specialists that organizations turned to when cutting-edge strategies failed to produce sustainable results, when they discovered that efficiency without effectiveness was just expensive mediocrity. The case studies we featured in our marketing materials told stories of transformation that went far beyond improved metrics. Companies reported cultural shifts where employees felt more connected to their work because they understood how their roles contributed to genuine customer satisfaction. Clients described relief at working with partners who prioritized long-term success over short-term optimization. Entire industries were beginning to recognize that authentic relationship building wasn't a nostalgic throwback to simpler times. It was a sophisticated competitive advantage in an increasingly complex marketplace. Maria knocked on my office door, interrupting my review with her usual efficient smile. She had been my first hire when the business outgrew what I could manage alone, a former hospitality manager who understood that excellent service was both an art and a system. Over the years, she had become far more than an assistant. She was the operational backbone that allowed me to focus on strategy and client relationships, while ensuring that every detail of our practice reflected the excellence we promised to deliver. "Your 2 o'clock is here early," she announced, and Marcus Chen just called requesting a meeting to discuss what he described as a strategic opportunity. "Should I add him to your calendar?" The irony never got old. Marcus had become a semi-regular caller over the years, reaching out whenever Rodriguez Marketing Solutions faced challenges that their internal team couldn't resolve. Sometimes he wanted to license our methodologies for specific client situations. Sometimes he sought advice on competitive responses to firms that were implementing our approaches. Sometimes he simply wanted to understand why companies were choosing authentic strategies over his organization for major consulting engagement. I had maintained a professional but distant relationship with him, accepting consulting projects when they aligned with our strategic interests, but declining opportunities that felt more like desperate attempts to access our intellectual property than genuine partnership. The dynamic was exactly what it should have been. He needed our expertise far more than we needed his business. "Schedule him for next month," I told Maria, "and make sure he understands that any strategic discussion will need to include a comprehensive brief on their current challenges and specific objectives for the engagement." The 2 o'clock appointment was with Elena Vasquez, whose organic food distribution company had been my first client and had grown into one of our most important long-term partnerships. She visited quarterly to review results and plan expansion strategies, but these meetings had evolved into something that felt more like collaboration between equals than traditional consultant-client relationship. Elena's company had become a showcase for what authentic relationship marketing could achieve when implemented with consistency and strategic vision. Her customer retention rates exceeded industry averages by substantial margin. Her referral-driven growth had eliminated the need for expensive acquisition campaigns, and her team's satisfaction scores reflected the kind of workplace culture that emerged when everyone understood their role in creating genuine value for clients. "I wanted to update you on the European expansion," Elena said as we settled into the comfortable seating area where I conducted all client meetings. The space was designed to feel more like a living room than a conference room, encouraging the kind of open conversation that produced the best strategic insight. She outlined how the relationship management principles we had developed for her domestic operations were being adapted for different cultural contexts and regulatory environments across European markets. The process required careful attention to local customs and communication preferences, but the fundamental approaches to trust building and value delivery remained remarkably consistent across cultural boundaries. "The interesting discovery," Elena continued, "is that European customers are even more responsive to authentic relationship building than our domestic market. They've apparently become tired of American-style aggressive marketing tactics, so our approach feels refreshing and trustworthy by comparison." The conversation reinforced something I had observed across multiple clients and industries. Authentic relationship marketing wasn't just effective in our local market or with specific demographic groups. It was a universal approach that resonated with human psychology and business dynamics regardless of geographic or cultural context. The methodologies I had developed were proving to be scalable across virtually any market where companies needed to build lasting customer relationships. After Elena left, I spent some time reviewing the international expansion plans that had been occupying increasing amounts of my strategic thinking. The demand for our services had grown beyond what we could serve effectively from a single location, and we were beginning to establish partnerships with consulting firms in major international markets who wanted to license our methodologies and implement them with local clients. The intellectual property licensing agreements had become a substantial revenue stream, providing income that wasn't dependent on my personal involvement in client engagement. Companies across 4 continents were paying significant fees for the right to use frameworks and assessment tools I had developed, creating passive income that would support the business even if I chose to step back from active consulting. But stepping back wasn't something I was considering seriously. The work remained as engaging and meaningful as it had been during those early months when I was rebuilding my career from scratch. The difference was that I now had the resources and reputation to pursue the most interesting and challenging projects, rather than accepting whatever opportunities were available. The phone rang with a call from Dr. Amanda Foster, the consultant who had ironically played a role in my departure from Rodriguez Marketing Solutions years earlier. She was now running her own practice and had been referring clients to us when their needs exceeded her capabilities in relationship marketing. The professional world was smaller than it appeared, and success had a way of creating unexpected alliances. "Stella," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had learned to respect expertise she had once undervalued, "I have a client situation that I think would be perfect for your team. It's a technology company that grew through acquisition but is struggling to maintain relationships with customers from the acquired firms. They need someone who understands how to blend different organizational cultures while preserving customer loyalty." The project she described was exactly the kind of complex strategic challenge that had become our specialty. Companies were increasingly discovering that growth through acquisition or rapid scaling created relationship management problems that couldn't be solved through better software or improved processes. They needed strategic approaches that addressed the human elements of business relationships, areas where our expertise had proven uniquely valuable. "Send me the details," I told her, "and I'll have someone from our team reach out to schedule an initial assessment." The casual way I delegated the initial client development reflected how much the business had evolved from my early days of handling every aspect of operations personally. I now had senior consultants who could manage significant engagements independently, allowing me to focus on the most strategic clients and the development of new methodologies that would keep us ahead of market trends. The team I had assembled represented a careful balance of experience and innovation, combining professionals who shared my commitment to authentic relationship building with younger consultants who brought fresh perspectives on implementation and technology integration. The culture we had created valued wisdom over novelty, effectiveness over efficiency, and long-term success over short-term optimization. Thursday afternoons were reserved for team development sessions where we shared insights from current engagements and collaborated on improving our methodology. These meetings had become some of the most intellectually stimulating parts of my week, combining the practical problem-solving I had always enjoyed with the theoretical exploration that came from working with diverse clients across multiple industries. This week's session focused on adapting our relationship audit framework for companies operating in heavily regulated industries where compliance requirements sometimes conflicted with authentic engagement strategy. The discussion was led by Sarah Chen, a former pharmaceutical marketing manager who had joined our team after her previous employer had struggled to implement our approaches within their regulatory constraints. "The challenge," Sarah explained to the group, "is that authentic communication in healthcare marketing requires transparency about product limitations and side effects, but regulatory requirements often make that transparency feel like legal documentation rather than genuine relationship building." The conversation that followed demonstrated exactly why our team approach was so effective. Different consultants contributed insights from their own industry experience, identifying patterns and solutions that none of us would have developed working in isolation. The framework we refined during that session would eventually become a standard methodology for companies operating in regulated environments, adding another specialized capability to our service offering. These collaborative development sessions also served as training opportunities for newer team members, exposing them to the strategic thinking that differentiated our approach from traditional consulting services. Instead of simply implementing predetermined solutions, they learned to analyze complex relationship challenges and develop customized approaches that addressed root causes rather than surface symptoms. Friday morning brought the monthly financial review meeting with my CFO, Patricia Walsh, a former banking executive who had joined our team when the business outgrew my ability to manage financial planning personally. The numbers she presented continued the growth trajectory that had characterized every quarter since our founding, but they also reflected the strategic decisions we had made about sustainable expansion rather than maximum revenue optimization. "We're turning down more business than we're accepting," Patricia noted, reviewing the opportunity pipeline that tracked potential engagements. "The demand for our services is substantially higher than our current capacity, even with the international licensing agreement." This was a problem I had never anticipated during those early months, when I was grateful for any client willing to work with an unknown consultant. The success of our methodologies had created market demand that exceeded our ability to serve directly, forcing us to become increasingly selective about which opportunities aligned with our strategic objectives and cultural values. "The waiting list for direct consulting services now extends 14 months, Patricia continued, "and we're receiving inquiries from companies willing to pay premium rates for expedited access. The licensing agreements are generating substantial passive income, but they're also creating competitive pressure as other firms implement our methodologies." The competitive pressure was something I monitored carefully but didn't worry about excessively. Our success had inevitably attracted imitators who tried to replicate our approaches without understanding the theoretical foundation and practical experience that made them effective. Most of these attempts resulted in superficial implementations that failed to deliver sustainable results, ultimately reinforcing the value of working with the original developers of the methodology. More interesting were the consulting firms that approached us about strategic partnerships or acquisition opportunities. The business I had built was now valuable enough to attract serious acquisition interest from larger organizations that wanted to add our capabilities to their existing service portfolio. The offers were substantial, representing financial independence beyond anything I had imagined when I started the practice. But selling wasn't something I was seriously considering. The business had become more than a source of income. It was the platform for work that I found intellectually challenging and personally meaningful. The financial success was gratifying, but the professional satisfaction of developing solutions to complex strategic problems was what made the daily work energizing rather than routine. The afternoon brought a conference call with business school professors from 3 universities, who were collaborating on a comprehensive case study of relationship marketing evolution over the past decade. My company's growth and impact had become a teaching example for courses on entrepreneurship, strategic consulting, and customer relationship management. "What we're particularly interested in," explained Robert Chen from Northwestern's Kellogg School, "is how you identified market opportunities that larger consulting firms had missed, and how you developed competitive advantages that have proven sustainable over multiple market cycles." The conversation reminded me that the business success was built on strategic insights that had broader implications for how companies approached customer relationships and competitive position. The methodologies I had developed weren't just effective consulting tools, they represented a different philosophy about business relationships that was being studied as a potential model for sustainable competitive advantage. The case study research also highlighted something that I sometimes lost sight of in the daily demands of running a growing business. The transformation from discarded employee to industry leader represented more than personal career success. It demonstrated that experience and institutional knowledge could be transformed into competitive advantages that were more valuable than technical innovation or operational efficiency. Saturday morning, I allowed myself the luxury of sleeping late and enjoying a leisurely breakfast, while reading industry publications that kept me informed about market trends and competitive development. The articles increasingly referenced approaches and concepts that our firm had pioneered, often without attribution, but clearly influenced by the work we had been doing for years. One article particularly caught my attention, a feature story about Rodriguez Marketing Solutions' recent struggles with client retention and market positioning. The piece described their challenges in language that sounded remarkably familiar, identifying exactly the problems I had predicted when Marcus had explained his vision for restructuring and innovation. According to the article, the company was experiencing what industry analysts called growth without foundation, expanding rapidly through aggressive business development, while struggling to maintain the relationship capital necessary for sustainable success. They had apparently achieved the scale and technical sophistication that Marcus had prioritized, but they had sacrificed the strategic foundation that made growth profitable and sustainable. The irony was profound but no longer surprising. The company that had determined there was no space for relationship-focused expertise was now struggling with relationship-focused challenges that their innovation-oriented team couldn't resolve effectively. They had optimized for everything except the human elements that ultimately determined business success. The article mentioned that Rodriguez Marketing Solutions was seeking strategic consulting support to address their retention challenges, though it didn't specify which firm they were working with. I suspected it wasn't us, given that our waiting list and premium pricing made us an expensive solution for problems that could have been prevented with better strategic planning. Sunday evening, I treated myself to dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown, celebrating another successful week with the kind of quiet satisfaction that had replaced the anxiety and uncertainty of my early consulting day. The financial security was wonderful, but the professional confidence was even more valuable. I no longer worried about whether clients would appreciate my expertise or whether the market would support my approach to business development. The restaurant overlooked the city skyline, providing a panoramic view of the business district where I had once worked as an employee and now operated as an independent consultant whose expertise was sought by companies across multiple industries. The physical perspective mirrored the professional transformation. I was now looking down at challenges I had once viewed from ground level, with the clarity and confidence that came from proven success. As I reviewed my calendar for the coming week, I realized that every appointment represented choices I had made about how to invest my time and expertise. Client meetings with organizations that appreciated strategic relationship building, team development sessions that would advance our methodologies, speaking opportunities that would expand our market influence, strategic planning meetings that would guide our continued expansion. None of these opportunities had existed when I was clearing out my desk at Rodriguez Marketing Solutions 5 years earlier. They had been created through systematic effort to transform institutional knowledge into market value, to convert professional experience into competitive advantages, and to build something sustainable rather than just lucrative. The journey from that devastating conversation with Marcus to this position of market leadership had required courage, strategic thinking, and persistent effort. But it had also revealed capabilities and possibilities that I never could have discovered while constrained by traditional employment relationships. The rejection that had initially felt like professional death had actually been liberation from limitations I hadn't recognized. Looking ahead, the future held possibilities that continued to expand rather than narrow. International markets beckoned with opportunities to apply our methodologies in new cultural contexts. Technology partnerships offered ways to scale our impact through digital platforms that enhanced rather than replaced human relationship building. Academic collaborations provided opportunities to influence the next generation of business leaders through research and teaching. Most importantly, the work itself remained as engaging and meaningful as it had been during those early months when I was rebuilding my career from scratch. Every client represented new challenges to solve, new relationships to build, and new opportunities to demonstrate that authentic engagement was not only more ethical than manipulative tactics, but also more effective for sustainable business success. The transformation was complete, but the story continued. The woman who had been told there was no space for her expertise had created her own space in the marketplace, and that space had grown large enough to contain, not just her own success but the success of clients who benefited from her methodologies and team members who shared her commitment to authentic relationship building. Rodriguez Marketing Solutions had made their choice about my value and my future. I had made different choices in response, and those choices had led to independence, influence, and impact that exceeded anything I could have achieved within the constraints of their organizational structure. It was a lesson in strategic thinking that extended far beyond business consulting. When someone tells you there's no space for your contribution, sometimes the best response is to create your own space and make it large enough that they have to acknowledge what they chose to give up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.